Database. We're going to create a database to ask four simple queries, and we're going to use information that we input into the database to answer those queries. We're starting off by adding our three tables that we're going to need in order to answer the queries. We're starting off with our students table, and then we're going to have our student ID, our first name, and our last name of the student. We're going to change the student ID to being just a number field since it's going to only contain numbers. We're going to input all of our students' information into the students table. Using our tables, we are going to answer four queries, and they're only going to be related to Mr. Potter. Our first one that we're going to ask is going to be how often did Mr. Potter study for his classes this semester? Our second will be how often should Mr. Potter have studied for his class? Our third one will be how much additional time should Mr. Potty study for his classes? And then the fourth one, overall, how much additional time should Potter study for? After we get our three tables of information inputted, we will move on to actually designing the queries. We're done with our students table, so we're going to move on to our next table. Which is going to be the classes table. We're going to have our class ID, our course name, our section number, our term, and our credit hours. We're going to change the data type on several of these to being numbers since they will only contain numbers. Then we're going to input all of our information for each of the classes. Then we're going to move on to our third table, which is going to be our student and classes table. We're going to have our ID, which is going to be a number type. We're going to have our class ID, which again will be a number type. We're going to have our student ID, which will be another number type. And we're going to have the hours studied, which will be another number type. And then we're going to input all of our information for this table. Now that we have all of our information input, we can move on to our queries. We do need to make this hour studied a decimal place field, and we can change the decimals to only having 2. And we also need to make note that in order to find the required time studied for each class, it's going to be our credit hours per class times 2. We will use that in our second query. Right now we're going to use our first query, which is how often did Mr. Potter study for his classes. So we're going to add all of our tables to our query. And then we're going to start adding the actual things that we need to our query. So we're going to start off with last name. We're going to go to course name, have credit hours, and hours studied. And to make sure that we only pull up Mr. Potter's information, we're going to type in Potter so it doesn't pull up all the other students as well. And we're going to run it, and we're going to have all the information for hours studied per course for Mr. Potter. We're going to save that as Potter studied time per class. And then we're going to move on to our second query. I'm going to add our tables into our query again. And this time we're asking how often should Mr. Potter have studied per class. And again, we're going to use that in order to find the required amount of time, it is the credit hours per class times 2. So we're going to add our last name, course name, credit hours, and the actual hours that he studied. And then in this next field, we're going to zoom in, and we're going to name it the required studied time, since that's what we're trying to figure out. And we're going to actually build the calculation to figure that out, which is the credit hours per class times 2. And then to make sure that we get this in a decimal format, we're going to go to the format and we're going to put it into a fixed number. And then we run to make sure that our query gives us the answers that we're looking for. And again, if we just run it like this, we get all of the students' information, but to make sure we just get Potter's, we type in Potter in the criteria under the last name, so it can filter out only just the Potters. And we can see it all, and we save this query as Potter required study time. Then we move on to our third query, which is going to be how much additional time should Potter have studied for his classes now that we know the actual required time versus what he actually studied. So we're going to go by last name, course name, credit hours, and then we're going to go back in and get the required amount of time. So we rebuild our required amount of time calculation, which is the required study time, and it's the credit hours times 2. And then again, we're going to make that into a decimal field, so we change the format to fixed. And then we're going to add the actual hours studied that he did for each class. And then we're going to find the difference between the two, which is the study time deficiency, which is the required study time minus the actual hours studied. And again, this will show us all of the students' information unless we go back in and under the last name in the criteria section we search just for Potter, because we only want to pull up his information. And we see that we get all of his information, and we have the course name, the credit hours, the required amount of study time, the actual amount of study time, and then the deficiency between those two numbers. And then we're going to save that one as Potter study time deficiency. And then we're going to move on to our fourth query, which is going to be overall how much additional time should Mr. Potter have studied. So we're going to add in our tables, and we're going to get that information. We're going to use last name, and again we only want Mr. Potter's information, so we're going to type in Potter to filter out everybody else. We're going to get the sum of the credit hours, which is going to be the sum of the overall credit hours, and then we're going to get the sum of the required study time, which in order to get the required study time is the credit hours times 2, and then we're going to add that total up. So we do the sum of the actual credit hours and multiply that by 2, and then it adds all together. And then we're going to get the sum of the hours studied. Then we're going to get the sum of the study time deficiency, which is going to be the sum of the required amount of study time minus the sum of the actual hours studied. We're going to get the totals. That way it groups it all into one, and we're going to change all of our calculations to be the expressions that we created. We're going to run it, and it's going to give us the sum of the credit hours, the sum of the required hours, the sum of the hours studied, and the time deficiency hours. And we're going to save that as Potter sum total.